accused of targeting civilians, the Saudi-led coalition at war in Yemen. The UN says that more and more civilians are dying, including children. There are calls for the coalition to be blacklisted. But what's the international community doing about it? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian. Finighan. Yemen is being pounded on an almost daily basis from air and land. The latest attack came on Friday when a Saudi-led coalition airstrike hit a residential area, killing at least 14 people, including 5 children. On Wednesday, a hotel north of the capital, Sanaa, was also hit. 41 people were killed, many more were injured. The Saudi bloc said that those it killed were militants. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment, but first, our report from Duncan Crawford.
Pictures of the destruction in Yemen are beamed into the homes of millions of people almost every day. But the international community has so far failed or been unwilling to stop the bloodshed. This is the damage caused by some of the latest airstrikes on the outskirts of Sanaa. Adults and children dead, homes destroyed, and the desperation of survivors searching for loved ones among the rubble and bloodstains.
Saudi warplanes targeted the house of my brother and his neighbours. I don't know what they're looking for and what they want. They're not fighters, they're civilians.
A Saudi-led coalition of countries has been bombing Sanaa and other parts of Yemen for more than 2 years to try and restore the internationally recognised government ousted by Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. But as well as bombing military targets, the coalition is accused of killing hundreds of civilians. Dozens of people, reported to be farm workers, died in a strike on this hotel on Wednesday. Attacking civilians is a war crime, if proved to be deliberate. The coalition spokesman says Houthi fighters were the target. The UN has called for a comprehensive and impartial investigation. Human rights groups accuse both sides of committing atrocities. After more than 2 years of fighting, at least 10,000 Yemenis have been killed. Millions are on the brink of famine and the economy has collapsed. To add to the crisis, a cholera outbreak has killed more than 2,000 people and infected 500,000. Hospitals which could help stop the spread of the disease are destroyed, along with other buildings and infrastructure. Saudi commanders insist coalition warplanes avoid civilian targets, but many have been hit.
I think it's important that the High Commissioner for Human Rights and other bodies record these incidents and we make sure that there's some collection of evidence so that at some point in the future there will be some sort of recrimination, there will be some sort of punishment for those who have been behind some of these acts that have taken place in this conflict, which go against international humanitarian law.
The US and its Western allies have sold billions of dollars worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia, backing the coalition militarily and politically. But as more civilians die in yet more airstrikes, that support is increasingly controversial. Duncan Crawford, Al Jazeera.
The United Nations has called for an impartial investigation into this week's Saudi-led airstrikes. Amnesty International says the coalition rained down bombs on civilians while they slept. The International Committee of the Red Cross condemned the latest raid, calling it outrageous. And a recent UN draft report concluded that the Saudi-led coalition has committed grave violations and wants to have it blacklisted for violating child rights in Yemen. This echoes similar findings from last year. The UN at the time did blacklist the coalition but caved in under pressure when Saudi Arabia said that it would stop funding some UN programmes. And this is what the US ambassador to the UN had to say.
I can tell you Yemen is something we are extremely concerned about. I personally had meetings with the Saudis and OCHA last week in terms of Hudaydah, of the airspace, of trying to get the cranes in, working on all of those things. We're extremely concerned, but we have a good flowing conversation with the Saudis to make sure that they understand what our concerns are and to talk about where we go from here.
Well, we wanted to invite a spokesman for the coalition onto the programme to answer some of the criticisms made against its actions in Yemen. Our calls went unanswered. So let's bring in our guests for today's programme. From London, we're joined by Nigel Timmins, the Humanitarian Director for Oxfam, who's recently been in Yemen. From Istanbul, Afshin Shahi, senior lecturer in Middle East politics at the University of Bradford. And from Beirut, we're joined by Adam Barron, a visiting fellow for the European Council on Foreign Relations, Middle East and North Africa programme. Afshin, I want to start with you. The UN's been as good as useless as far as stopping and preventing civilian deaths in Yemen is concerned. Why is that?
As you mentioned it yourself just a few minutes ago, about a year ago, United Nations blacklisted the Saudi-led coalition effectively for violation of human rights and being responsible for 60% of mortality among children in Yemen. But in the matter of days, the Saudi-led coalition inserted a great deal of pressure on Ban Ki-moon, at the time the General Secretary of United Nations, to reverse that decision. And unbelievably, the United Nations actually did reverse the decision and effectively approved the violation of human rights on the ground in Yemen. And this is exactly part of the problem. And the United Nations over the last 2 years have failed to provide effective leadership to bring an end to this crisis. And as long as the UN cannot act as an impartial actor, as long as the UN can be easily intimidated and bullied by kind of some of the players on the ground, it is very difficult to kind of see a situation where the UN or other actors in the international system could actually effectively act as a mediator.
Adam Barron in Beirut, what do you make of what you heard just there? Will the current Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, be any firmer with the Saudi-led coalition than his predecessor? Do you think he is going to put the coalition on this list of countries and entities that kill and maim children?
I think it remains to be seen. But, you know, as we've seen under Ban Ki-moon, there are a lot of institutional pressures that prevent decisions like this from being made. That being said, one thing that I'd also want to stress too is it's not just the coalition that is committing alleged violations of IHL in Yemen. A lot of the other warring factions are. You have shelling in Taiz, you have a continued spree of detentions in Sanaa carried out by the Houthis, the latest of which just 1 week ago saw the detention and continued detention of Hisham al-Omaisi, a Yemeni political activist who was actually a frequent guest on this program, in addition to a continued pattern of tit-for-tat violence that's emerged in the south where the Houthis have largely been pushed out of. So I think it's also key when we're discussing alleged violations of international humanitarian law in Yemen, it's key to remember that there are a number of factions, even though obviously only one is receiving US, UK weapons and support.
28 schools were destroyed by coalition aircraft last year, Adam. And as the Saudi-led coalition is the only force in Yemen with warplanes and helicopter gunships, it is the most likely perpetrator of such acts, isn't it? I mean, the coalition is responsible for more than half, according to the UN and other international agencies, of all the civilian deaths that have occurred in Yemen.
I mean, that would be, according to UN figures, yes, that's what's true. And I think one of the things that is crucial is that to sort of lend voice to the calls by many Yemeni activists and human rights activists who have called for an independent international inquiry into the violations of IHL in Yemen. At this point, there's only one real UN-backed inquiry, which is sort of under the aegis of the internationally recognized Yemeni government, which is a bit paradoxical because they're obviously a faction involved in this conflict. So I think what is crucial is to continue backing calls for this international and independent inquiry into the violations of human rights, war crimes in Yemen.
Nigel Timmins from Oxfam, as we said at the beginning of the programme, you've just come back from Yemen. Tell us something of what you saw of the situation there.
Sure. Well, I mean, the conflict has just led to a gradual erosion of the economy, and people who used to have houses, used to have businesses, have had to flee and find bits of land or friends or relatives where they can stay. But then, you know, at first they would sell their jewelry, they would sell what assets they had, and gradually the level of poverty has got greater and greater to the point where they can't even feed their own children. So we're seeing, huge numbers of people at risk of famine across Yemen, which is an entirely man-made situation. And then the impact of that malnutrition means that people's immune systems are a bit weaker. The collapse of the economy, the collapse of governance services means there's less clean water around, there's a weaker infrastructure for the health service. And this has allowed the endemic cholera that exists in Yemen anyway to really spike. We now have the biggest cholera outbreak in the world in Yemen, more than 500,000 cases. And I met people who were making desperate choices with so few resources. Do I choose to buy some food for my family, or do I choose to use those resources to take my very ill, one of the members of the family, to transport them to a health centre many miles away? So, very impossible choices. And I think the most chilling quote I heard was of women boiling stones so they could tell their children they were having soup. Some people in Yemen are facing the most desperate choices on a day-to-day basis.
Nigel, is there a sense of frustration, of anger among your fellow aid workers, among aid workers on the ground in Yemen at their impotence, if you like, the fact that they just don't have the resources can't get into Yemen so that they can help people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's frustrating both because being a conflict situation is clearly a man-made situation. The whole context is, not some sort of God-given natural disaster. This is because of political choices different actors have met. But then on top of that, actually operating in that space, trying to provide the very minimum basic access to food, the very minimum basic access to water is incredibly hard. Whether it's about being given permission to visit certain locations, we face a mountain of bureaucracy, whether it's about bringing goods in. Both sides make it an extremely difficult operating environment. The lack of concern for the civilian population expressed by the authorities and by the powers that back the warring parties is deeply disappointing.
Afshin, the Secretary-General, the UN Secretary-General's report, at least in this draft form that has been released to the media, says that the Saudi-led coalition has committed grave violations of human rights against children in the last year. Have war crimes been committed in Yemen? Is anyone likely to face prosecution for war crimes when this is all over?
It is very unlikely anybody facing persecution in the current situation. We live in a time that actually the world leaders, including the President of the United States, are lining up to go to Saudi Arabia to sign arms contract. It was only a few months ago President Donald Trump chose Saudi Arabia as the first destination to visit as the president, and basically he regarded that trip as one of the greatest victories he had so far in the White House, because he managed to sign a contract which was worth around $100 billion of arms contract. And other European leaders look at basically look at Britain and so many other countries that are effectively lining up to enhance their arms dealings and arms contracts with Saudi Arabia. And in a situation like that, it is very difficult to see if the international community going to kind of pressurize Saudi Arabia to face their reality. And of course, we have to be kind of fair here. Of course, there are atrocities committed on both sides. But Saudi Arabia, as a member of United Nations, should act more responsibly. And unfortunately, in the current situation, over the last 2 or 3 years, Saudi Arabia have not acted responsibly. And as the United Nations have been suggesting over the last 3 years, it is responsible for violation of human rights. And in the report that they suppressed last year, it was suggested 60% of the mortality among children was directly caused by the Saudi-led coalition.
Adam, what do you make of what you just heard there? When faced with inclusion on this list last year, Saudi Arabia threatened to withhold the funding that it had provided for major humanitarian operations. I mean, it should have been on notice after the threat to include it last year and that threat came to nothing in the end. Why didn't it change its behaviour in the last year? Why didn't it work harder to stop civilian casualties?
Well, I think I would point, instead of pointing to New York, I would point to Washington in that case. Don't forget that we've had a dramatic shift in the White House. While the Obama administration was indeed quite supportive of this conflict, at least in the early stages, by the waning days of the Obama administration, you had a significant amount of pressure, especially in the person of former Secretary of State John Kerry, sort of pressuring the Saudis and really aiming to some extent to bring the war to a close. With the rise of the Trump administration, you have not seen that. And indeed, you have a Secretary of State who is new in the job. You have a Department of State that in many ways is lacking the capacity due to the lack of key positions that are filled to even exert pressure if it wanted to. So I think in a lot of ways, the political chaos, for lack of a way to put it, in Washington has really given the coalition and other countries worldwide a free hand a bit. And you're seeing the results of that to some extent in Yemen.
All right, so do you think, Adam, that the inclusion of Saudi Arabia on this list, if this draft report is published in full, would be enough to shame Saudi Arabia and its allies in the coalition and its American backers into ending the slaughter in Yemen? Or do you think it'll backfire for the UN?
I would say that it's, unfortunately, I doubt it would have much effect, and indeed it does risk backfiring.
Okay, Afshin, do you agree with that?
Yes, I completely agree with him. Because, this report came out in 2016, and almost a year has passed, and we haven't seen any major kind of transition in the international system. I mean, we have seen kind of the continuation of the status quo. Only about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we heard that maybe some members of the Saudi establishment, including the new Crown Prince, is now looking for an exit strategy because effectively he can't see any kind of meaning in continuation of the conflict because their victory and their gain over the last 3 years has been unbelievably limited. So, I mean, unless something happens on the ground, which basically forces them to get out of the country, I very much doubt it if there will be any pressure from the international community to kind of stop them.
Nigel, we're always hearing in the media that Yemen has become one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world at the moment. Almost 3 million Yemenis internally displaced, acutely malnourished children and people in dire need of food assistance, the highest in the world at the moment. Health services devastated. The cholera epidemic that you talked about, which killed nearly 2,000 people as an infected, 500,000 people in just 3 months, more than 7,600 people dead, 42,000 wounded. I mean, working as you do for an aid organisation, don't you wake up one morning and think, well, when is the world going to stop this madness?
Frequently, yes. I mean, what's so disappointing in all this is how other interests, whether you call them geopolitical or, economic, because let's be clear, some of the powers backing the warring parties here are making money through arms sales. The fact that they can tolerate such high levels of civilian suffering and not take seriously their responsibility under international humanitarian law or even basic morality is profoundly disappointing. And, part of our role as humanitarians is to keep trying to raise up the plight of the situation in Yemen, the plight of people, the individual stories, the women I met who, when I asked them what's their main source of income, said begging. And these were women who had used to run businesses. These were people who had careers and sent their children to school. I met children who've not been in school for 3 years. For the world's powers to allow that situation to develop in the name of some other interest, it is just, complete lack of moral leadership.
Picking up, Adam, on what Nigel was saying there about arms sales, the UK approved a further $365 billion worth of arms sales to Saudi Arabia earlier this year, having sold it $3 billion worth in the 2 years before that. How much responsibility for what's happening right now in Yemen does the UK and other arms supplying countries have to bear?
No, I would say, you know, the UK, the US, other arms suppliers in Europe are certainly at the very least indirectly responsible for what's happening in Yemen. And let's not forget that even beyond the issue of arms sales, a lot of the conflict that's happening in Yemen stems from a failed, internationally backed, and indeed internationally celebrated transitional process that took place between 2012 and 2014. And in a lot of ways, I would say that the US, UK, European, UN role in all of this has played more in terms of fueling this conflict than arms sales alone. I think that's something that when we're going back and writing the history of all of this, I think that's something that needs to be held accountable for.
So are you saying that I mean, if the US, if the UK, if those who sell arms to Saudi Arabia just said, right, stop, enough is enough, then the war in Yemen would be over?
No, I mean, to be honest, if the UK, US, I mean, this is completely separate from the moral issue of arms sales, but I mean, if the US and UK said, stop, you know, we're not going to sell arms to Saudi Arabia anymore, I'm sure Saudi Arabia would find plenty of other people to sell that are willing to sell them arms, whether in Asia or elsewhere in Europe.
Okay. Afshin Shahi, Saudi Arabia is already putting pressure on the UN, as it did last time around with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, to water down this draft report, which may see it ending up on this list of countries. What are the dangers if the current UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, succumbs to that pressure, if you like, if he suppresses or waters down that report?
I mean, you have to kind of look at the context and look at the history of this organization. What happened last year in 2016 was not the first time that the UN had to subordinate itself to pressure and bullying from other member states in order to change its position. A short while before 2016, the UN was pressurized not to include Israel on the same blacklist as well. So basically, if you do look at kind of the wider context, if you do look at kind of the wider historical background, you see that, you know, unfortunately, this has been happening repeatedly. And unfortunately, these kind of incidents significantly undermine the reputation and the credibility and the capability of this organization. And of course, we have to be honest and we have to be realistic. I very much doubt it if we're going to see a major turning point in the current administration. Of course, Ban Ki-moon did not prove to be the most effective leader in the history of United Nations, but I doubt it if the current General Secretary can fundamentally change everything. And time again, the UN has proved that it is prone to bullying and it is very vulnerable. And as soon as basically some countries intimidate the organization by suggesting that they're going to cut funds, they're going to cut money, they are very quick to unfortunately reverse their position. And this is exactly part of the problem.
Nigel, we'll leave the last word to you on today's programme. What needs to happen and what needs to happen now to save lives in Yemen, to end the suffering?
Yeah, the key thing is that, you know, the war needs to stop. So the different political powers need to apply pressure to the warring parties to seek a resolution to this conflict through discussions and diplomacy, not through fighting. That's step one. Step two is we need more assistance in country, whether that's you know, food aid, whether it's support to the civil service so that we can ensure that health centres and water services are working. There's a need for a lot more resourcing. At the moment, despite all the suffering, despite what the world knows, the UN appeal is only about 40% funded. So the combination, the root cause, tackle the war, fund the aid effort.
All right, we'll leave it there. Many thanks indeed. Nigel Timmins, Afshin Shahi and Adam Barron for being on today's programme. And thank you, as always, for watching. Don't forget, you can see the programme again at any time just by going to the website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, join us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.